Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. As the Valley's urban population continues to grow, the ability to rely on groundwater is actually shrinking. Years of overpumping have led to dire consequences: dry wells, contaminated drinking water, and sinking land, otherwise known as subsidence. In response, in 2014, the state enacted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, which requires the formation of local agencies to develop plans to bring groundwater basins into balance by 2040. What does that mean for the Valley's growing urban population? We'll ask the author of a recent report on that very issue today. His name is Dr. Andrew Ayres. He is a natural resource economist with the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Hi there. Thank you very much for having me on.
So, many folks have heard SGMA. They think, I know that, I've heard that somewhere, but they really don't know much about it. Can you give us some basic details of SGMA?
Absolutely. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, colloquially known as SGMA, was a set of legislation adopted in 2014 that spells out big changes for groundwater management across the state and in particular in the San Joaquin Valley. So basically what this legislation requires is that local groundwater users and other relevant stakeholders are going to have to form groundwater sustainability agencies in the Valley. These have already been formed. And those agencies are going to have to put together groundwater sustainability plans that will chart a course towards sustainable management by 2040.
Yeah.
In the Valley, in the critically overdrafted basins throughout the Valley, these groundwater sustainability plans have already been put together and submitted to the state for initial review. And so that initial review is ongoing, and these plans are going to be updated every 5 years by these groundwater sustainability.
Well, what can you tell us about the current water situation in the Valley, ag versus urban use?
So there's no doubt that agriculture is the predominant user of water in the Valley, whether that be surface water or groundwater pumped out of wells. But increasingly, urban water users are expanding their use, despite being only 3 or 4% of total water use in the Valley. That's expanding, and that's expanding both on the side of surface water and groundwater, depending on what utility we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm just SGMA's been around for a while. In 2014, it was passed. I'm just wondering, we're several years in. How's it going?
Well, it's going well. If you look at the groundwater sustainability plans that have been submitted thus far, they reveal a recognition of the state of persistent overdraft in the region's groundwater aquifers. And they present some very promising projects and actions to address that level of overdraft. In some of those plans, there's quite a bit of optimism about the amount of new recharge that can be introduced into groundwater aquifers, whether that's through recharging normal, regular surface water supplies or capturing new flood flows that previously have been uncaptured. There's a lot of optimism around that. Ultimately, in our review of the plans, we found that optimism represents perhaps more planned recharge than there's actually water for. So working on the demand management side, actually reducing the amount of groundwater pumped is going to be part of the equation as well.
It seems like there'd be, incredible competition between ag and urban users for waters that's getting a little bit more scarce. I mean, we relied a lot on pumping, right? So we have a drought, you pump a well, then you pump a little deeper, then you pump a little deeper. And the other problem too, I guess, is as you lose that water in the aquifers can collapse, subsidence when the ground goes down, right? And so once you lose that groundwater, that aquifer, it ain't coming back. There's nothing you can do then.
Right. Subsidence is a big problem. This has been ongoing again for decades as the groundwater has been overdrafted. Recently, there have been high profile articles in the New York Times and other outlets about this.
And think about like, for example, even, the Frying Kern Canal. I mean, if subsidence happens there and the land shrinks, then the canal, breaks and then it doesn't flow water as easy. You could have streets that are sinking, that all these repairs, it has a lot of implications, obviously. We've only got about 30 seconds left, but I want to ask you this last question in this segment, and that is, there are some big risks for urban water utilities. What are the biggest ones you see coming forward with the implementation of SGMA?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, Mark, there's a need to address the fact that the population is growing. They're going to require more water in the future, but at the same time, their ability to access groundwater, oftentimes a reserve for them in the past, is going to be constrained. So finding innovative ways to find long-term reliable supplies for the new development that population is going to require is an area of uncertainty and an area where they're going to need to be innovative.
Okay. Well, up next, we're going to discuss some of those challenges in the SGMA future. What does it hold for urban water users, and what can we do now to address those future challenges? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. It probably comes as no surprise that urban water users rely heavily on groundwater to meet their water needs. With the state requirement to bring groundwater basins back into balance by 2040, that reliance is going to have to change, most likely. In short, we're going to have to figure out how to do more with less. And as our population grows, by the way. We're talking with Dr. Andrew Ayres, a natural resources economist with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Ayres, I guess the first place to start is to figure out what our current demand is for water. So how much water do we use in the valley, and what are the future projections?
Well, in the urban sector, as I mentioned earlier, the level of water use is small relative to agriculture, but it is growing. In fact, projections suggest that by 2035, 2040, there may be an additional 1 million residents in the valley, and they're going to need water to fuel their development. The pace of expansion in the most recent set of urban water management plans was fairly high, and in many cases, those plans still revealed a high reliance on groundwater, not just today, but also moving forward.
It's just, I'm trying to think, how do we get those groundwater basins recharged if we're still drawing from them? I mean, that's something for people like you and the scientists, I guess, to figure out. But let me ask you this. So the per capita use in the valley, I'm just wondering, how does it compare to the state average? Do we use more or less water? Has it been increasing or decreasing? And what's behind those numbers?
So in the valley, writ large, average per capita water use, so this is the amount of water that people are using individually in their homes and on their landscapes, is higher than the statewide average. But it has been declining over the past decades. One important factor in that decline is the introduction of metering for water use at the household level. In the past, household water use was typically not metered. Increasing metering allows people to know how much they're using, and it also allows utilities to charge them according to the amount that they're using.
That was actually a big battle in Fresno a few years ago when they went to meters. And it's interesting, normally conservatives, believe in the market mechanism, but even though it was, politically conservative area, they did not want to see water meters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe it. I mean, I think there's the flat rate that existed before you're able to meter people's water use is not good at encouraging conservation. And in moving forward in a world where the ability for these utilities to expand their amount of groundwater use is going to be constrained, it's really important for them to have the opportunity to help constrain demand through innovative new pricing approaches.
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of our water comes from groundwater pumping. How much of it comes from groundwater pumping, and how will those SGMA requirements impact the supply of water for the valley?
So the answer to that question varies a lot depending on where you live. So in the larger utilities in the valley, they have a mix of groundwater and surface water, so water diverted from surface streams and other reservoirs in their portfolio. Smaller and even medium-sized utilities in the valley are typically almost entirely, if not entirely, groundwater dependent. Getting off of groundwater, as might make sense in the future where groundwater access is more constrained, is actually a big problem for utilities because the economies of scale you need in
Right.
order to treat surface water are actually quite substantial.
Yeah, and that is a big issue in some of the smaller communities in the valley for sure. One thing we haven't factored in, we haven't talked really about is climate change. I'm just wondering how climate change impacts the demand for water and then maybe the supply of water as well.
Climate change is going to have impacts on both sides to a large extent. I mean, I think what people say about climate change is that water is the knife water is the knife that's going to cut deepest when it comes to climate change. And in that sense, mostly they're talking about the supply side. Climate change is going to change the amount of runoff we get to some extent, maybe not so much in the valley, but especially the timing of that runoff. And thus the supplies available to the utilities. But on the demand side, we did some estimation. We did some work in this report to estimate what might be the impact of climate change on the demand side in the valley. It's modest, but it's there. It might increase demands for things like in-home water use or especially landscape irrigation up and down the valley.
We've only got about 30 seconds left, but I want to ask you this. The total demand for water in the valley is going up, but the per capita demand has actually been decreasing. I'm just wondering, we're asking people to be more efficient with their water. How much more can we ask of them before it starts impacting their quality of life?
That's a great question. I think one of the places where there's an opportunity to reduce household water use and water use in residential settings is in outdoor landscape irrigation. This is a story that's told across the state. But this outdoor irrigation use is especially high in the valley. There are opportunities for reducing that, but we're not talking about people taking out trees. We're not talking about treeless neighborhoods. We're just talking about perhaps being a little bit more efficient in the way that we irrigate lawns and other types of landscaping, and in some cases, replacing that landscaping with other varietals that use less water.
Yeah, I'm seeing that in my neighborhood. I'm sure people are seeing in their own neighborhoods. Well, up next, we're going to talk about smart urban planning and how that might be able to reduce the demand for water. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're speaking with Dr. Andrew Ayres with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California about valley water generally and urban water use in particular. We're talking earlier about urban water use, and a lot of it is simply maintain outdoor landscaping. The state and the valley are struggling with two goals. They want to have more housing, but they also want to stop depleting our aquifers, our overdrafted aquifers. Your report indicates that the answer may lie in smart land use planning. How so?
Right. So on the one hand, as we've mentioned earlier today, big increases in population in the valley will require more water use in urban settings, but at the same time, groundwater use is going to be constrained. What can we do with land use planning to help resolve that issue? Well, one major thing that we can do, and which we highlight in the report, is plan for additional recharge. But it's not true that you can just recharge new water into groundwater anywhere. There are certain areas that are better suited for it than others. Smart land use planners and water agencies working in tandem with them should work to identify places where where surface water can be recharged into groundwater easily and protect those areas from development today.
Yeah, so that's really speaking to is the role that cities and counties play in kind of this land water use issue, right? I mean, that's really what you're looking at. And a lot of these general plans, do they take water into consideration when they're deciding where houses go or how many houses are being built?
Well, so general plans in the valley certainly do take water into account. As part of our work in this report, we assessed the extent to which they do, and we found explicit mentions of water in nearly all of them. But we believe there are opportunities for tighter integration here, and in particular, integrating longer-term planning in these general plans around how SIGMA implementation will impact things like water supply assessments for new development. Those are the kinds of things where more opportunity for integration is available.
Yeah, I mean, do you have the water? You want to build a housing development, but do you have the water to supply? And you do see a lot of, low-scape, hardscape around it in these new developments, and yards, frankly, are quite a bit smaller. I want to ask you about recharge basins. Important part of replenishing the underground aquifers. In the Fresno Clovis area, the Fresno Metropolitan Flood Control District has something like 150 recharge basins all over town to recharge the aquifer. Collect water slowly percolates down into the groundwater aquifer. Has land use planning, have they figured in how to use this for how to use groundwater recharge projects into the equation here?
I think there are two major things to talk about here. One is, in the future, there will be more recharge basins, but there's also an emphasis on capturing really high flood flows for recharge, which is a kind of a different beast, because when you're talking about a high flood flow, that's a lot of water that you might have to take off the river in a very short window of time. So there are new land use planning questions that are arising today around where might you do that? One area you might do it is in agricultural lands that can stand to take that amount of water and recharge it into the groundwater. Those are new long-term land use planning questions that are emerging. But another key aspect here is the opportunities for partnerships. Which is something that we emphasize in the report. Partnerships, for example, between urban water utilities who would like to secure some additional supply through this recharge, and agricultural entities who sometimes own the water rights that would end up fueling.
Right. One's got the money, the other's got the land. But I'm also wondering too, with climate change, we're talking about more of these torrential downpours. So a lot of water in a short period of time. Do recharge basins work in that situation, or do they work better?
Well, so your typical recharge basin that you're going to be designing for a certain amount of flow, at least historically, might not be sufficient for those high flows. If you look at an example from the Sacramento Valley, the YOLO bypass is kind of an example of what people are thinking about here. During really high flood events, that's a large area in between Sacramento and essentially running along the north side of the highway towards San Francisco that gets flooded big time during those large flood events. But that's a lot of acreage. You would need to find similarly sized areas to capture some of these high flows also in the valley.
Okay. Well, up next, there's a saying that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. But is collaboration the answer to our urban water challenges? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Dr. Andrew Ayres, an economist with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California, about how we can provide safe, affordable, and reliable water to a growing valley population who's in light of some multiple challenges, such as a growing population, increasing restrictions on groundwater pumping, and challenges brought about by climate change. The answer may be found in something perhaps we all should have learned in kindergarten, and that is to stop fighting and start thinking of ways to collaborate to solve our problems. So some of that stuff we learned way back when is actually helpful to our current situation today. Let me ask you this, Dr. Ayres. Recharging the groundwater seen as a great opportunity, but you note that it will call for an urban agriculture collaboration, which you talked about earlier. So you're talking about this partnership. Explain more about how those partnerships might work and maybe some examples that you've seen in the Valley.
Right. So on the topic of recharge, there are opportunities for collaboration where especially urban utilities might bring some resources to the table, especially funding, and agricultural operations might bring either water rights to fuel the recharge, lands for recharge, or other things of that nature. So there are some examples in the Valley. One of them is in Fresno, where the city of Fresno recharges surface water into their groundwater, their local groundwater aquifer, but they convey that water to the recharge site using conveyance infrastructure owned by Fresno Irrigation District. That's the type of collaborative recharge partnership that we're thinking about, and that could prove important in the Valley moving forward.
If I'm right, they refer to that as leaky acres.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. People who live in the area, if they drive on 168 and they look to the east, they will see this area of water where water is being collected. So that's what we're talking about. Let me ask you this. Urban utilities have used water markets, water trading to access surface water, as well as to diversify their water supply. I'm wondering, is the same thing going to happen to groundwater? Are we going to see groundwater markets?
So you're right that in the Valley, there has been a history of water utilities engaging in transactions with agricultural water districts to acquire supplies to fuel their development. In the future, we believe that in the Valley's critically overdrafted basins, groundwater markets based on allocations of who's allowed to pump how much are going to be a key component in managing demand in the future. And this will allow for trading of groundwater pumping entitlements, not just between agricultural users, but also potentially from agricultural users to urban utilities who require that new supply and that new reliable supply to fuel development.
Yeah, and markets, drive behavior. So it would seem that if markets work in many situations, why not with water? Why not with groundwater? Now, let me ask you about smaller communities. We talked about that earlier, and one of the kind of unique challenges here is that smaller communities rely heavily on groundwater. So what partnerships can we develop to kind of solve some of the challenges that smaller communities have when it comes to water?
Yeah, you're 100% right, Mark. So those small communities oftentimes are very reliant on groundwater, and they're reliant on shallow wells. And at the same time, oftentimes they'll also face water quality issues when they access that groundwater. So some of the things, and I think it's important to note here that the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is not implemented if there aren't solutions for these small communities moving forward. So some of the partnerships that we envision in the report are, to some extent, recharge partnerships where urban utilities who are setting up a recharge project anyways could do so in such a way that benefits a small rural community by placing the recharge near them. There are some concerns there about potential water quality considerations, but nonetheless, that's a promising path forward. But also more generally, there are opportunities for larger utilities that have sort of capacity, know-how, and funding to provide technical assistance to smaller communities, as well as, in some cases, potentially consolidate.
That is a really big issue. I remember a number of years ago, we were raising money for air quality issues, and we wanted to get electric buses first. It's a little bit different, but stay with me. It's on point. Getting electric buses for some of these smaller communities, and they did not want the free buses because their maintenance people didn't know how to fix them. And so, the technical aspect of this is also important in terms of helping these smaller communities. Let me ask you this. I want to see if I can fit in two more questions in about a minute and a half here. One is, what's happening in other states? It can't be unique to California. Are they dealing with these same issues in other states?
Yes, they certainly are. So water policy typically in the West is managed at the state level. So there's a lot of variation across states. But increasingly, groundwater management is becoming an issue all across the Southwest and the West more broadly. For a long time, people, agricultural users, urban users, others have accessed groundwater more or less unconstrained, and increasingly the need is becoming apparent for more constraints on groundwater access and more proactive management. So Arizona and its rural areas is facing this looming problem right now. In Texas, there are also similar issues that their groundwater conservation districts are beginning to address. So this is not unique to California.
I want to encourage our audience to take a look at the PPI website, and they've also got so we don't have time to talk about them, but you've got recommendations that state and local government can do to help and address this problem. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Andrew Ayres with the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California, And thank you for joining us. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute.
If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.